بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد اللهم ربنا لك الحمد والشكر كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك وعظيم سلطانك اللهم إنا نعوذ بك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك أما بعد. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I greet you with the Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum, may the peace of God be upon you all. And good evening, and I'm truly humbled and privileged, in fact, to be standing before you here tonight. And you didn't need to read the whole Bible. There is a beautiful teaching in Islam. It's a dictum, it's a hadith by the Prophet, "Man la yashkur al-nas la yashkur Allah." Whosoever doesn't thank people does not thank God. And that's very, very powerful and very important. And it's interesting because this tradition speaks of people, not Muslims. Whosoever doesn't thank people can never be able to thank God. And this is particularly important for religious people who assume or claim to worship God and thank God. And the commentary of this particular narration is that if you're unable to thank people who do favors to you or are good to you visibly, you can see these favors. How in the world are you going to truly thank God who does unto you favors? Many of them are unseen. So thank you very much, therefore. I want to first thank, of course, the Commissioner himself, Mr. Chen, for his wonderful, wonderful humanity and for being a human, which is very important. I think what is often missing in leadership positions is being a human. And what Jacinda Ardern demonstrated to us post-Christchurch is that being a human is actually very, very important. And she demonstrated beautifully restorative politics. And Dr. Nizar and Dr. Nizar is actually the expert in Islamic leadership. We often talk about this restorative leadership, human leadership. To be a human and to show vulnerability as a human being. We're not all perfect, nobody's perfect in fact, but also to be able to say, you know what, I don't know. And that's what you have been saying. I don't know, I need solutions. And that is really important for us. As you know, the Muslim community has been over-surveyed and over-analyzed to the extent that it has become rather problematic for the community to be engaged in another project. And sadly, I must say, not to be pessimistic, I want hope to overcome fear tonight, but to be realist, and that is many of these projects don't end up in positive outcomes for us. So I do hope that this one will. So thank you very much, and we're very grateful and indebted to the work that you do, and to your team, Liz and Gillian, and Medina, of course, and of course to PwC for hosting us. Without you hosting this event, we won't be here. And not the least, of course, the most important people here are yourselves, the men and the women, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. It is exceptionally important that you are here. Leaders cannot lead without followers. And leaders will not be able to implement, nor should they actually lead on their own. We need to be able to stand up as followers and tell our leaders whether they are doing the right thing or not the right thing. And every now and then say to them, you know what, you need to be a human. Just be a human. A few days ago, I gave a seminar to the senior staff at the university on post-Christchurch reflections. I visited Christchurch twice, and I gave a post-Christchurch reflection. And the theme of my discussion was that interconnectedness must prevail, and I'll speak on this theme in a second, and we must break the cycle of hate. So therefore, thank you so much for being here. And we would not do justice to the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islanders if we don't acknowledge them. And they have been acknowledged, but never can we acknowledge them enough. The atrocities and the tragedies that they had to face over the last 2 centuries, we will never be able to fix that. Never. The generational trauma that they have undergone is deep, and nobody will understand it unless people who have gone through similar trauma. And therefore, to again acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, is the least that we can do. And so I am glad to be doing so, following the two previous speakers. So really, tonight I'm going to talk about Islam in Australia, and it's going to be very brief because of time. But before indulging in this discussion, allow me to say that this discussion about Islam in Australia is not to demonstrate us and them, but rather it's to talk about us. And for me and my colleagues and friends who have been listening to me for a while, the story of Islam in Australia, just like the story of the Chinese in Australia and the Vietnamese in Australia and the Italians and so forth, must by necessity allow us to begin to think about this theme of interconnectedness. Interconnectedness as humans, interconnectedness of our own civilizations and cultures and values and norms, despite our differences. And let's be frank, if we are humans, and we should be humans, let's be very frank. We will never be the same. And we should never be the same. We will continue to have differences, and we will be fooling ourselves if we think we won't have differences. But it is in spite of these differences that we must focus on the interconnectedness. And we must focus on that which unites us and that where there are commonalities. Of course, there will be individuals and groups from all sides who will try to focus only on that which separates us. But we must not succumb to that narrative, and we must be able to provide a counter-narrative that speaks of interconnectedness. And so my discussion tonight about Islam's history, or the history of Islam in this country, is not to boast about Muslims in Australia, but to rather state a fact that hopefully can allow us to begin to interconnect with each other as humans. And there are two important principles, or two important practical measures that are useful to allow us to get together and really begin to constructively think positively of the other. One, factual knowledge. Factual knowledge is very important. We need to know about the other factually and not build our assumptions of the other based on hearsay or stereotypes or prejudice. That's unfortunately what happens in all of us. Why? Because we're human. So factual knowledge, and I want to share with you factual knowledge. And secondly, intercultural engagement. This is intercultural engagement. These two things, research has demonstrated that when these two things are coupled together, factual knowledge and intercultural engagement, then we can get somewhere. And I want to share a personal story that happened post-Christchurch, very quickly. Post-Christchurch, sadly, one would think that hate speech would reduce and diminish. But in the UK, statistics show that hate speech increased by 600% in the week after Christchurch. And the case in Australia, I don't know the figures here, but I do know that there were a lot of posts, there were some, I don't want to exaggerate this, there were some hate speech posts on social media against Muslims in South Australia, which led to the tightening of security in universities and so forth. And in an institution, a particular institution, a senior figure said something horrible about Muslims on their Facebook, which was picked up by the administration of the institution, and they came to me and they said, you know, this is really bad, this is not acceptable, and we are thinking of sacking this person. And my immediate response was, please don't do that. The person has a family, he has children, and this is his livelihood. And most likely, I can reassure you that his prejudice and hate is based on the fact that he doesn't know. So if you allow me to sit with this person, then let's see how we go. And of course, they were quite concerned about that, because from the discourse or the content of his social media posts, it was quite harsh. And so they were concerned. Nevertheless, the meeting happened. And HR came to me and they said, are you sure you want to do this? And I said, yes. And we'll have to facilitate it. I said, you really don't need to, but they had to facilitate it. So this is what happened. The meeting was at the HR office. I went there. The gentleman was sitting in a way that he was totally disinterested. But as soon as I walked in and he saw me, he said, "Wow, you're a tall man. Have you played basketball before?" And what do you think happened next?
Start talking basketball.
Yeah, that's it. It was solved. I said, "Yeah, I played basketball. I was in Sydney. I played in the senior basketball team, and we won this New South Wales senior basketball team when I was there. Not because I was in it. I could say because I was in it, but not
You're
because I was in it. And I said, I was playing at high school, when I was at Miller's High School, and a friend pushed me while I was in mid-air, and I landed with my arms, and they were both broken, and I went to year 11 or year 12, and I only took 1 day off. How stupid was that? I should have taken a week, 2 weeks off." And that's how we started. And then we began a conversation. And of the things that he was unaware of, that Muslims only make up 2.6% of Australia. 600,000 only, according to the 2016 statistics census. He said, "Only?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I thought you were 50%. Why do you think that is the case? Because of what he's been seeing on media. In fact, it is sad to say that the overrepresentation of Muslims in the media is just pathetic, right? So very quickly we became friends. And the point is engagement at the personal level, to give a face to the other and to think of the other as a human is so important. So most people think the first encounter of Muslims in Australia was in the 1800s when the cameleers came, the Afghan cameleers, and that is not entirely correct. In fact, the first Muslim visitors came in about 1650 or 1700, and they came from Makassar, as you can see on the map, which is from Indonesia. And they came, so they were coming to Australia at least 150 to 200 years before European settlement. They used to come on a regular basis for over 200 years. And they used to come and buy tripang or sea cucumber from the Aboriginal people and go and sell it in the Chinese markets. And the relationship of the Makassar with the indigenous elders of Arnhem Land particularly, and the Aboriginal people of Arnhem Land was very, very positive, as we shall see in a second. So this is the earliest confirmed contact, but towards the end of this presentation I'm going to challenge that, in fact, and I'm going to argue actually that Muslims may have come here 1,000 years ago, right? So they visited the shores of Arnhem Land every wet season for more than 200 years until the White Australia policy. This is when they stopped. And if you go and speak with experts in the field who've done research on this, like Professor Regina Ganter, who is at Griffith University and a former colleague, she wanted to do a bit of an experiment, and she went to the elders of Arnhem Land, and she wanted to, by way of teasing them, to say that when the Makassar Muslims, and they were Muslims, we can't deny that fact, the Makassar Muslims came to Arnhem Land and they traded with the Aboriginal people, their relationship was very negative and they were very violent people. And she said every time I said that, there was an immediate reaction from the elders where they said, "No, that is not true." The relationship that we had with the Makassar people was very, very positive. And we traded with the Makassars. And this was fundamentally the reason that they came to Arnhem Land to trade with the Aboriginal people. And that is why a friendship was developed, because the Aboriginal people saw the Makassars not as settlers, but as visitors, which is very important, right? So they didn't come to settle, they didn't come to dispossess the owners of the land from their land and take over, but they came with an appreciation of the Aboriginal people and their culture and the fact that we can learn from them and benefit from them. And this is a very, very important point to underline. This idea of appreciating other cultures and learning from them is so important that often goes missing. One of the reasons people decide to go and invade other countries and dispossess them of their lands and subjugate them is often because of a supremacist attitude that says we are better than you and there is nothing we can learn from you. Now, had the European settlement, and I don't want to get into negativities here, but had they looked at the Aboriginal culture and civilization and said, wow, you've been on this land for at least 60,000 years, if not more, 120,000 years if you speak to the Aboriginal people, and there is so much to learn from you, then maybe we wouldn't have, excuse the expression, stuffed up the land as we have now. We would have perhaps learned from them environmental conservation methods and we would have learned from the Aboriginal people how to manage this, the largest estate on the face of the earth. But because the mentality was there is nothing to learn from them, and that they are backward, and they are barbaric, if you like, then we've shut ourselves from the possibility of learning anything new. But this is not peculiar to the relationship between white European settlement and Aboriginal people. This could happen to any of us. When we have this attitude, that's a closed-minded attitude, that there is nothing to learn from the other. And that is highly problematic. And this is where racism and extremism and racism and prejudice comes in. Not to focus too much on Islamic jurisprudence, but what most people don't realize is an aspect of Islamic law, Islamic jurisprudence, is that you cannot derive a law within a particular context or culture without an appreciation of the cultural norms and customs of people. In Arabic, the maxim is al-'ada muhakkama. 'Ada muhakkama means culture is authoritative. What does that mean? It means you must, by necessity, appreciate the cultures of the people that you're engaging with, especially when it comes to the formulation of legal statutes and law. Otherwise, you will ruin them, right? And so the trade with the Makassars was fundamentally important, and it was simply trade. It wasn't to settle. This is a drawing, it's a photo actually, 1845 picture of the Macassans at Port Essington on the Herbert Peninsula. And it shows how the Macassans were trading and still engaging with the Aboriginal people. The fishermen usually camped along the Arnhem Land coast, catching, boiling and drying tripang. They met, traded and worked with local Aboriginal people. This is an image, it's an Aboriginal drawing of the boats that the Macassars used to come with. And until today, if you go, you find, in fact, inscriptions in caves and drawings of Aboriginal people that honor the engagement that they had with the Macassar people. In fact, the Macassar did not settle in Arnhem Land, but as I said, they did have an influence on the Yolngu people society and ritual, which is quite interesting. It's not, they didn't come with the idea of dispossession, but they came, one, we can take from you, but there is also the possibility of exchange. Exchange of culture, exchange of ideas, exchange of values. There is nothing wrong with that. Again, if I was to draw on Islamic jurisprudence, there is a general principle that Muslim jurists speak of, and that is culture is positive. You must never see culture in terms of deficit, any culture. And rather the formula should be, we take anything that is good, useful, and merely harmless from any culture and make it part of my identity. And that is why in the formation of an Islamic Australian identity, or a Muslim Australian or Australian Muslim identity, it is necessary to examine the prevailing cultural practices within Australia and to absorb from those that which is good, useful, and merely harmless to form what we may call an Australian Muslim identity. And not to fall in this black and white mentality that says, I am not going to take anything from you because mine is best. That is highly problematic. Now, if anyone studies history objectively, yes, there were periods of upheaval between Islamic civilization and Christendom or Europe. They were there. But what is unfortunate in the writing of history of civilizations is that there is almost a dismissal of the positive contributions that each civilization had on the other. And I always argue that the Greek civilization would not have achieved what it had achieved without relying on the Egyptian civilization. And the Islamic civilization would not have achieved what it had achieved in science and mathematics and astronomy without relying on the Greek civilization. The work of Aristotle and Ptolemy and Galen. Muslim classical scholars, when they spoke of Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher, they spoke of him as a Shaykh al-Kabir. A Shaykh al-Kabir means the great master. Because they didn't find it problematic. The fact that he did not believe in the oneness of God and he wasn't a Muslim does not mean that I can't learn something good from him. And they did. And the Islamic civilization, in terms of its science and technology and mathematics and astronomy, would not have achieved what it had achieved without reliance on the Greek civilization. And also, Europe and the Western civilization would not be where it is today without relying on the Islamic civilization and the Indian civilization and the Chinese civilization and the African civilizations. But how often do we hear that? How often do we hear it? We don't hear that stuff. And when I attended the 2020 summit, when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, one of the things that I argued for is that we must start at early age in schools teaching children about their contributions of other civilizations. So when this child grows and sees his Indian schoolmate, or Chinese schoolmate, or Muslim schoolmate, he appreciates the contributions that they have made and not see them in deficit terms. You agree with that? Right? As somebody from education, I'm sure you would agree with that. Right? Just walking in, when I walked in and I was speaking to my friend here, and he said he teaches humanities at school. And I immediately said to him, you know how humanities emerged? Humanities in the Western tradition came from humanism. And it started from about probably the 14th century. Humanism was very much influenced by another discipline in the Islamic civilization known as al-adab. The Imam and the brothers and the sisters here who know anything about the concept of adab. Adab means more than manners in Islam. It means the refinement of the individual. Adab means the refinement of the human being so he can become or she become a human being. That's what humanism started off with. And humanities, by extension, is intended to refine this human so he becomes, excuse the expression, cultured. Now, there would have been no humanism or humanities in the Western tradition without adab in the Islamic civilization. And we just had that quick conversation. And then I also said to my friend here, I said, the other thing that people don't know, and this is where interconnectedness is important, and that's why this discussion about Islam in Australia should be extended further and talk about civilizational interconnectedness. That's what we should be teaching in schools, right? We need to develop positive identities in people. And Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus, the 1600 famous Polish astronomer mathematician, who toppled the Greek cosmological understanding of the universe. Until Copernicus, it was the Ptolemy's concept of the geocentric view of the world, Earth-centered universe. Ptolemy in the 1600 came and mathematically proved otherwise, that it's a sun-centered, heliocentric. Okay, so what? Well, so what is this? In 1950, original documents were found in the American University of Beirut by students of a professor of mathematics and astronomy called Professor Hartnett, an American professor. The manuscript was in Arabic, and the person who found it could not read Arabic, but he recognized the diagrams, and he said, I've seen these diagrams somewhere before. Then a scholarly endeavor to find out about this discovery, and after years of research, they came to this conclusion. It is not whether, but it is when and how Copernicus learned from Muslim astronomers 200 years before him. In other words, Copernicus could not have arrived at his heliocentrism without the work of Al-Tusi, Al-Shirazi, and Al-Urdi, who were 200 years working before him in Isfahan in Iran, the boogeyman now, as a comedian, Iranian comedian says, you never see, Western media going to Iran, going to a bakery, showing an Iranian baking a cookie. You never see that. And if you see them baking a cookie in Iran, then there might be a bomb under the cookie. Right? So this interconnectedness, my friends, is so vital and so important. When we speak about the histories of people, it's not to show off, but it is to perhaps instill, if you wish, a fundamental important principle, and that is the interconnectedness of humans and civilizations. And so the people, this is what the people who live in the Milwaukee or northeastern Arnhem Land region are known generally as Yolongo people, or which simply means people. And words such as rupiah or money were introduced by the Makassars. And so if you go to the Arnhem Land and you speak to the Yolongo people, they use the word rupiah, which means money. It's a Bahasa word, and introduced metal blades, knives, axes, which transformed Yolongo people. This is a growing a rock art site in the southeast of Groot, Inland, depicting a Makassan prow or Makassan boat. Again, to demonstrate the positive relationship they have. This is what a senior ranger from an Aboriginal corporation in Yarakla in northeast Arnhem said. And people dance, people sing about them, meaning the Makassa. And it's very important in these days for Yolongo people to remember them, that they came and they were the first contact for Yolongo people. After 1901, the newly formed Australian government banned Tripangers from Makassar in order to protect Australia's territorial integrity and to encourage local Tripang industry. In 1907, the last prow or boats from Makassar visited Arnhem Land. This is a picture of the Tripang or the sea cucumber. Now, straight after that, we had the Muslim cameleers who came in the 18th century, essentially between 1860 and 1920. Approximately 2,000 cameleers arrived in Australia to participate in the historic Burke and Wills expedition from Melbourne to the Gulf of Carpentaria in June 1860. These are our original images, and if you're interested in knowing further, I would recommend this particular book, Australia's Muslims Cameleers, by Philip Jones and Anna Kenny. Now, although they were known as Afghan cameleers, they weren't all Afghans. They were Pakistanis, they were Baluchistanis, and they weren't all Muslims. Many of them were, but not all of them were Muslims. In fact, some of them were Hindu, some of them were Sikh. They came from Baluch, from Pashtun, from Kashmir, from Sindh, and neighboring ethnic regions. But they became commonly known as the Afghan cameleers. One of my close colleagues at the University of South Australia, Professor Irabina Wrigley, whom we know very, very well, he's an Aboriginal elder. He's a renowned scholar of education, Aboriginal education, and we get along quite fine. And he often says this to me. He says, Mohamad, in my family, I have the Abdallas and the Singhs. Right? When he traces his family, he will come to the Abdalla and he will come to the Singh. If you go to Alice Spring now, go to Alice Spring and you will see Aboriginal brothers and sisters. And especially if you go dressed like me, they will come to you straight. They say, hey brother, that's how they call it. Hey brother, they'll call me. And you go to them and he says, welcome brother. And what's your name? I'll say Muhammad. And you? Michael. Michael what? Michael Smith Abdullah. Because of the presence of the cameleers. See, when the cameleers came, the men came by themselves and they all came with the full gear. But they didn't bring their wives with them. So many of them, ended up marrying Aboriginal ladies. Some married European ladies, but the bulk of them married Aboriginal women. And wherever they went, they established mosques. In fact, the oldest mosque in Australia happens to be in Adelaide, as you know. The one in the city, but older than the one in the city, is this one in Maree. And there is this lovely plaque that says, this is a memorial park dedicated to the memory of the pioneering Muslim cameleers and families of Alice Spring, or Maree. Now, the introduction of camels and the so-called Afghan cameleers proved to be a turning point in the exploration and development of the Australian interior. You couldn't do it with a conventional vehicle. You needed camels. And guess what? We have more camels in Australia today than Saudi Arabia. Seriously, we have more camels in Australia than probably in the Middle East. And because the wild camels, they kill them and so forth. And many times when I go to Qatar, or when I visit Qatar or Oman or Saudi, they say, can you be the link so we can buy some of these camels? Well, not really. For a short period of time, from the 1860s to the early 1900s, these cameleers and their ships of the desert became the backbone of the Australian economy. And we can't forget that. Just like the Italians and the Chinese and the Cambodians and everybody else contributed tremendously to the making of Australia, so were them. But in fact, there is an argument that Muslims may have possibly come to Australia even before the Macassars. And in a recent article in The Guardian in 2019, it says it could change everything this is the title of this article. Coin found, actually it's coins found off Northern Australia, maybe from pre-1400 Africa. And I'll tell you the story in a second, and then we'll finish off just in another 2 hours. So it says, experts believe they may have found a Kilwa coin or coins that could change what we know about the history of global trade and also the history of Islam in this country. Right? Essentially, the coins were found in 1940s by a trooper who was sitting guarding the shores of Darwin, and bored out of his brains, he began digging the sand, and just didn't have to dig much. He came across a number of coins. He kept these coins in his pocket, and he put them in a small tin, and he put them away, and then after a while he gave them to the museum. Museum kept them for a while until very recently they said, we better do some work on this. And a American professor by the name of Ian McIntosh, you can go and Google this because Google is the answer to all solutions. You can Google Ian McIntosh, and you find that they began researching this, and they found something interesting. They found that these coins had weird language on the back. This weird language is Arabic, by the way. And it says this Sultanate Banu Kilwa. Sultanate Banu is the province of Kilwa. Kilwa is there. You see that map? This is Tanzania. And you see the arrow there that says Kilwa district. It's 10,000 kilometers away from Australia. The coins that they were using 1,000 years ago, because remember one thing, 1,000 years ago Africa was prosperous. Before colonization, Africa was very prosperous. Tanzania was very prosperous. And in fact, from the Islamic historical tradition, Africa played a significant role in the transmission of Islamic knowledge. And what many people don't know, even today, that some of the greatest Muslim scholars, both men and women, and who are the most erudite in the Islamic tradition, and who have memorized literally by heart not 1, not 2, not 10, but hundreds of classical books, including the Quran, are not in Saudi Arabia. They're not in Qatar, they're not in Oman, they're not in Jordan. They are in, where in Africa? Mauritania. Mauritania. When the Mauritanian ladies, the mothers, rock their babies to sleep, if they're not reciting the entire Quran by heart to them, they are reciting classical poetry to them or composing poetry as they are rocking their children to sleep today. Right? The legacy of Africa is so much understudied and undermined, sadly. And today, as you know, the African people are going through all sorts of ordeal, again, because of perceptions and because of stereotyping and so forth. So the coins were found, and it was found that they have Arabic writing, and definitely they come from Kilwa, because that's what it says. And we know that Kilwa about 700 to 1,000 years ago was prosperous and was trading with Asia, incidentally. And so it is now assumed that these coins may be 1,000 years old and could rewrite Australian history if proven. Now the question that is being asked now is, how in the world did these coins actually make it to Australia? And so there are a number of theories, and none of them are conclusive yet. One theory is that actually the Tanzanian Africans, and it was a Muslim state at the time, did come to Australia and traded with the Aboriginal people. That's number one theory. Number two theory is that perhaps they actually went to Indonesia and traded with the Indonesians, left some of these coins, and the Makassars, when they came here, brought these coins with them. But none of these theories are conclusive, but the point remains is that whatever the answer is, it could compel us or force us to rethink. I think whether these coins or not, I think we do need to rewrite the history of Australia to acknowledge the Aboriginal people in much better terms. Just to finish off, then Muslims started coming post World War I and World War II, waves of Muslim immigration starting with small numbers from Turkey, 1911, Albania, 1920s, and increased migration from Lebanon after the Lebanese Civil War in 1970. Has anyone been to Mariba? Does anyone knows where Mariba is? other than the Queenslanders, right? The troublemakers. Mariba is about 60 kilometers north of Cairns. It's in the hills there. And I mentioned Mariba because we talk about Albanians who came in 1920. Many of these Albanians settled in Mariba and other places. If you go to Mariba now, and I said once to ABC Radio to go and do a story on them, because you go to Mariba, and you find a lot of Albanian Muslims there who are farmers and who are fairin kamozis, as they say, you know, with the very thick accent, very strong accent, with their, you know, kubra hats, and they're farming the land. And in the same family, you'll find the Muslim, Christian, and the atheist, because they've been there for a while. But even that perception of Muslim in Mariba can break and shatter down all stereotypes and preconceived notions of the Muslim, right? Today, and according to the latest census, and just to finish off, Muslims make up only 2.6% of Australia, and that's about 604,000. And so when I said this to the gentleman who was a bit concerned about us being 50%, I said 2.6%. He said, that's all? I said, yes. He said, what about in the UK? I said, it's almost the same. And then I said this to him, because he raised the issue of Sharia. You know, the S word, that when you mention it, people collapse. So, Sharia, I said, let's, you know, there's this always narrative that Muslims want to bring Sharia law, and they want to replace the common law with the Sharia law. And I say, let's hypothetically accept that argument. Let's accept that all Muslims want to bring Sharia law. And let's assume, hypothetically, that the 604,000 Muslims in this country, who come from 183 different countries, all agree what Sharia actually means. Let's just make that assumption. The Sunni and the Shi'i and the Albanian and the Turkish and God knows what, and the South Africans. We don't have anything against South Africans, except that Dr. Mahmoud Nafi is from South Africa. Let's assume all of us, and the Egyptians, Nadia, all of us assume we know what Sharia is and define it. And all of the 604,000 Muslims decide we want Sharia law in this country. Do you think it's going to happen? 2.6%. This is factual knowledge. Finally, cultural diversity is a point of strength and not deficit. Altogether, Australian Muslims come from 183 countries, making them one of the most ethnically and nationally diverse communities in this country. Let's see that as a strength, not a weakness. Let's capitalize on that and not see it as a point of difference. And there is always strength in diversity. Thank you for listening.